Today on Hands On Photography, I have some listener and viewer feedback that I want to share with you because you know what? You folks are awesome and I can't wait to share all of this wonderful information that comes from you as a listener with other folks listening to the show because this is just another great way to learn this wonderful craft of photography. Y'all stay tuned.
This is TWiT.
Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Pruitt, and this is Hands On Photography here on TWiT TV. I hope y'all are doing well. I am unbelievable as always. This is the podcast where I like to sit down and share with you different tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer as well as a better post processor. If that's the kind of content that you're looking to find and you're just getting into the wonderful world of photography, I highly recommend you go ahead and subscribe in whatever podcast application you're enjoying this on, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever Google's using nowadays. Go ahead and subscribe to Hands On Photography and be sure to leave me a nice rating and a nice little comment and review. That way the wonderful podcast gods will push this show on up in the ratings to help other people discover hands-on photography and help grow our hands-on photography community. Or you can just go to our website, twit.tv/hop. That's twit.tv/HOP for hands-on photography, and you'll see all of our previous episodes and subscription options there. So now let's go ahead and get started with this week's episode. This week I want to focus on you, our loyal listeners and viewers, and do a bit of feedback today. You guys continue to send in great questions and great images and sometimes some pretty funny stuff too. That email address is hop@twit.tv. I check it all the time and I try to answer them all as fast as I can. I'm slowly but steady catching up somewhat. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the feedback this week. There's two pieces of feedback that I wanted to share this week, and let's go ahead and grab this first one. This one says, it comes from Jennifer Mansfield. Dear Mr. Pruitt, I was recently going through all my photos, and I think this is one of my favorites, if not my favorite. I love how it's an arch in 3, and I just love it. I have not edited it at all, and I thought you could use it on the show as a way to demonstrate architectural photography. I mainly do this type of photography, and I would love to see what you think. You can use it on the air, and thanks a bunch. Keep well, Jennifer. Oh, such a kind message. So yeah, I got her image here inside of Lightroom, so let's go ahead and hop on over into Lightroom and take a look at this image. You know, she says that this is an arch of 3, and I love that. This is cool. From a critique standpoint, there are a couple things that stand out to me. First off, the framing. When you're working with any photograph, quite frankly, framing that shot is really going to make a difference beyond the obvious things like under saturation, out of focus, and things like that. But framing really does make a difference. This image here, you have this first arch right here. You have the second arch. Let me pop it there. So this is the first arch going around like that. The second arch is next in line as you go into the next level or layer of the image. And then there's a third arch back there in the back. So if we take a look at this first arch and look at the right side of the frame versus the left side of the frame, there's a problem. There's no balance there. There's no symmetry. And that's just basically because of the angle that this image was captured. I would find a way to step back into this when you set this up to allow yourself to get more of the left side of the arch in frame, just to give it a little bit more balance. But other than that, I'm good to go with this far as just the composition standpoint. Now, from a post-processing standpoint of it, and I know you haven't edited this thing just yet, but there are some things that comes to my mind, and that is these shadows. You look all the way back here in the middle of this image, all the way back. It's really, really dark back there. And I like that you could see a little bit of light there. That does give you some intrigue, but I think you can get even more intrigue if you could push those shadows up, you know, to make it look even better. back there in the background. So what I did was run it through my typical post-processing, and I'm not going to do it all right now. Actually, Mr. Victor will pull it up on the screen and you'll see me fast forwarding through it. But basically, I wanted to lift the shadows inside of this image to allow us to see more of what's going on back there in the back, as well as, heck, you could see a little more details here in the windows. So it just gives you just a little bit more interest and intrigue. And also I did decide to give it a little bit of color pop and change the mood a little bit with some warm colors and warm lighting. I even added an extra gradient filter on the top just to help light up the scene a little bit more with color and give it some more mood. And also inside of Lightroom, there are a bunch of different picture profiles. We've talked about filters and picture profiles in Lightroom before. And if you click this button on the upper right, you'll see all of these different filters that you could play with. And as you can see, I selected Artistic 3. One of my favorites is Artistic 4, but I don't think it would have worked well for this image. Artistic 3 definitely looked a lot better in my opinion. But yeah, I love your thought process in taking architectural photography. I'm right there with you. There's a couple things to consider when you're shooting architectural photography. We've been previously talking about lenses here on the show, and that makes a big difference. If you're taking a shot of a very, very large structure, you're probably going to want some type of wide angle lens, but there are going to be some limitations that you have to consider when shooting with a wide angle lens. As we mentioned before, you're going to get a bit of a bowing effect and sometimes some vignetting if you're shooting too wide, and the building will start to look a little bit distorted. So take that into consideration. Or if you want to use just a medium focal length, you're probably going to work out just fine with that, but you still need to find a way to properly get it all in frame. I believe she was using a point and shoot camera here, so it's got a what focal length? I think she shot with a wide focal length on this point and shoot. But with most point and shoots, you have a much smaller image sensor. I'm looking in Lightroom right now. Yeah, she shot this at 18 mil according to Lightroom, and she used a Nikon Coolpix. So yeah, that's a point and shoot camera, much smaller image sensor. So that 18 millimeter focal length is actually fairly tight on a small sensor like that. But again, it's neither here nor there, just something to consider when you're trying to frame up this shot and figure out exactly what you want to capture with your architectural photography. I love architectural photography. I love it for the colors. I love it for the actual structures. And I really love it for the texture. That's something else that I did inside of this image. I cranked up the texture and the clarity and the sharpness just a touch, just to bring the texture out of that image, because you got all of these awesome bricks and stones right there. Just give it a little bit more life with a little bit of texture. That's just how I roll. All right, so thank you for that message, Miss Jennifer, and thank you for this image. Nicely done. Next up, we're going to take a look at another bit of feedback. Okay, so another message has come in to hop@twit.tv via email, and this bit says, Ant, huge fan of the show. Can I get your thoughts on the photo I took of the sunrise in Charleston Harbor? This is the finished product that I did. Editing work was done in Pixelmator Pro. Feel free to use it on the show. Thanks in advance, Mr. James A. Gregg. All right here. So let's see what Mr. James is working with here in this image. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up Lightroom. Okay, so this is Mr. James's image here in Charleston Harbor. And this is a nice, looks like a sunrise photograph taken there at the beach. Got the wide range panoramic view here. I tend to like stuff like that because of just, again, it's an emotional thing when I'm out there and seeing stuff like that. But there are some things that I want to touch on in this image. So I'm going to nitpick you just a little bit, sir. Okay, so let's start with the technical aspects of this image. All right, so if we look over here in the bottom right of Lightroom, you'll see that this was shot with a Nikon D7500, which is a mighty fine camera, APS-C sensor or crop sensor. and he shot this with a 18 to 300 millimeter telephoto lens, and shot it at a fairly tight focal length at 105 millimeters, which is, there's nothing wrong with that, because it allows him to get the sun a little bit closer in view, and really it accentuate the size of the sun there. So I like that tactic, but there are some things you're going to have to consider with this. Okay, so shooting into the sun is pretty challenging because your sun is super duper bright, and your camera, when it starts to meter, is trying to figure out how to properly meter this scene, because it's got this really bright light source, and it's trying to tell your camera, oh, wait a minute, that's too bright, so let me back off on it a little bit. Next thing you know, the rest of your scene starts to go too dark. So yeah, this is really challenging to shoot sunsets like this, or sunrise in particular. So you already know you're on an uphill battle, but you did pull this off. But there are a couple things here to notice that may be useful for you next time you go out and shoot. So when you shot this, it came out at 1/500th of a second at f5.6. Okay, so f5.6 is not necessarily a tightened up aperture. It's fairly wide open for a lens just like that. Most lenses in that range and that price range, they don't really go much more wide open than say 5.6 or f4. It's a cost thing, and you're shooting that at 1/500th of a second. That's a really fast shutter, so it's not going to be a lot of light coming through, even though the lens is trying to get more light through. When you're having that f5.6, it's going to create some issues of softness and focus throughout the frame, because it's not a totally shallow depth of field, but it's getting there. So what you notice is in focus is right here in the center. The sunshine is that's fairly sharp, but then it starts to just sort of get fuzzy here in the water, and right here with these boats. These birds right here on the right of the frame, they're in decent focus, but then it starts to fall off again everywhere else in the scene. So if you're going to shoot this, you really have to consider the focal length on it, as well as the aperture. And I personally would have shot this at say maybe an f8 or maybe f11, somewhere between f8 and f16, because that's going to allow you to sharpen up most of the frame more so than the center of the frame in most cases. But by doing that, you're not going to be able to get as much light in to your sensors. So that means your shutter speed is going to have to slow down a little bit. So right here, shooting at 1/500th of a second, that probably wouldn't have worked at an f8. It probably would have needed to be at around maybe 2/50th of a second, something of that nature. But that's something to think about and consider. And then again, you have to make sure your horizon line is squared away. And I don't think that it is when I first take a glance at it. So let me go ahead and pull this up here in my little rotation and crop tool. We're going to rotate it. And yeah, if you look right there at the middle of the frame, and that line going across the screen, it's not perfectly lined up. So I'm going to rotate it and try to straighten out that horizon line for you, because that totally screws up a photo, in my opinion. All right, so we got that straight. And then again, we talked about framing in the previous feedback. I'm not sure what's going on here at the top of the frame. I don't know if you were like up under a canopy or something like that, but it looks like an interesting sky right there. And if you're going to have some type of framing like that, I suggest doing it more so to make it work for this image, because right now, because this is such a wide panoramic view, it almost looks like just a letterbox television show. You know what I mean? You know how movies will have the letterboxing on the top and the bottom of the frame because of this, they shoot with these anamorphic lenses. It almost looks like that. And I don't think that works well for your photo. I think it would look a lot better if you just got rid of that. Just go ahead and crop that out. And even a little bit more so on the bottom if you want. Unless you really want to have this surf in the foreground, go for it. But I would definitely get rid of that top portion there because it just doesn't add anything to the photo. All right. And before we get out of here, I want to touch on one more thing. And again, this is just a challenge from a technical standpoint because you shot this at f5.6. If you want, you could put a little post-processing into the water here. Because when you first glance at it, it just sort of looks noisy and a little bit muddy, no pun intended. I think you can just add like a little bit of noise reduction on it and see if we can clean that up. So we can do a selective noise adjustment by pressing K on the keyboard for our adjustment brush to pop up. And I'm going to select noise down here, push my slider up, and I'm just going to brush over this water a little bit just to soften it some to where it doesn't really look like distortion or look like grain. Just soften it up, smooth it out just a little bit. Something along those lines. And I could even take some of the clarity out too, just to smooth it out some. Because you don't want it to be like the grain is in focus, so just sort of smooth it all out. And that'll work a little bit better for you. But yeah, that's the route that I would go. Again, I give you kudos because you got to get up early to get sunrise photos. You got to get up early. You got to get to the spot to get prepared and be ready for that shot. And that takes a lot of work. So kudos to you for knocking that out. But again, just take in consideration the shutter speed and the aperture when you're dealing with landscape photography like this one here. If you have a higher F number, which is considered a smaller aperture, you're going to be able to get more in focus in your frame. And it's just the simple physics of how light passes through the lens and hit the image sensor, yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to nerd out about that. All right, so that is it. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Hands On Photography. Thank you all so much for the continued support of the show. Be sure to send this show to other prospective photographers out there looking to get better at taking photographs with their smartphone, iPhone, whatever they have, or whatever camera that they're using. It's all about the fundamentals, and it's all about getting out there and just creating some great art. Feel free to reach out to me just the way as Miss Jennifer and Mr. James did here, just shooting an email to hop@twit.tv, or feel free to tag me over on social media. On Instagram, I am ant_Pruitt, and on Twitter, I am ant_Pruitt. I love to hear from you folks on the social media. Thank you all again for the continued support. And now you all safely create and dominate, and we will catch you all next time. Y'all take care.
Hope you enjoyed that episode. If you would like to laugh while learning about how to take control and take advantage of all of the features that your iOS devices provide, then you should check out iOS Today. The show Rosemary Orchard, my co-host, and I, Micah Sargent, host every week on the TWiT network. It's all things Apple all the time.